It's always a good idea to review basic design principles when you're working with not only typography, but basically anything that you use in graphic design, such as imagery or graphic shapes. In this case, I'm going to focus more on the use of typography as they work with these basic design principles. So I'm going to give you a simple example of each of these 9 principles and how you can think about them when you're working with your text layouts. They are, of course, unity, variety, balance, rhythm, emphasis or focal point, contrast, breathing room or sometimes called negative or white space, proportion, and scale. The first one I'm going to show is unity, and I have very simple shapes here, and I have some Greeking text to show you examples of how a layout can bring together disparate elements to become unified. And what's working here as far as the layout goes is the way that these elements are aligned. That's what brings these into good unity. Of course, I'm using the same typeface throughout the piece, and that also adds to unity, but I'm pulling these ruler guides down here to show you how different elements are aligned on this piece here. And the most important ones are the 4 margins around the edges. The title and the left side of the paragraph here and the left side of this gray bar, which could be a photograph or it could be just a basic shape, really serve to bring it together because they're aligned nicely. You can see that there's alignment on the bottom and on the right as well. Now the darker gray square here the top of it is aligned with the baseline of the word unity, the title, but you could also extend it to the top of this lighter gray square if you wanted to align it with the top of the title. So you do have a little leeway there, but regardless of which you choose, the fact that these are aligned really tightly and nicely serve to give it a good unity and working well together. We can even get away with not having a straight edge on this paragraph. There's a ragged edge here, and that's okay because the outside elements are nicely tightly lined up and serve to work well together. So that is one way you can make unity work in your favor. Variety is another design principle, and these gray squares could indicate paragraphs of text. They could be text or imagery, whatever, but the thing that stands out, of course, is the variety of that red shape in the layout there. Now that could be text set in a different color. It could be a red bar with, say, white text inside of it to be a variety, give variety to the layout of black text on a white background, for instance. It could also be a nice way to separate this third rectangle on the right from the other 2 on the left. Sometimes you have a separate piece of text which is a different topic and you want to separate it from the others yet still take up the same amount of space. So putting a variety element in there, like a different color or a different font, something to break it up, gives visual interest to the page. And you'll get the hang of how to work with variety the more that you do it. A lot of these things take some time to develop, but the more you practice with them, the easier they will become, and you'll start to see ways to make them happen. Balance is the next principle here, and you'll notice that I have a series of rectangles on this page. Again, they could be text, they could be a combination of text and imagery, but they're illustrated here by the color that I've set these in. The largest rectangle is the lightest color, okay? But it is balanced by the smaller rectangle because the smaller one is a darker color. So even though the larger one is bigger, it still balances nicely because it's lighter, but it balances the smaller one quite well. Then we have the third element of the green repeated squares on top of the rectangle on the right there, and these are much brighter than the others, yet they're the smallest. So because they're brighter, their small size helps keep them in balance. So keep in mind that color and size can work to your benefit when you're trying to balance things. You can have something larger and it can be lighter, and the smaller element can be darker or brighter, and you'll get a good balance that way. And of course, alignment always helps to achieve the unity and also helps with a sense of balance. Rhythm is the next principle. Now, rhythm, here's a secret. The way to get a good sense of rhythm in any element you use, whether it be visual or typographic, is repetition. Repetition is what creates the rhythm. Okay, and I have repetition in each of these two words here. The word sail is repeated 5 times in different colors, different tones, so that it sets up a fairly smooth rhythm, but there's a progression there. It almost seems like you start out shouting the word sail, and then you speak it, and then you whisper it because it gets lighter. But the font stays the same, the size, the spacing, everything stays the same except the color. But the repetition is key to setting up the rhythm. And this is a fairly smooth rhythm. Now the word go on the right is a little different. There's some nice unity there because I've kept the same font and of course the same word, but I've changed the scaling, the color, and the angles at which these 3 words have been set. So the rhythm that's been set up here is more staccato, more jumpy, a little more active than the other one, but it still remains readable. And notice that I made the smallest word go the brightest color, again for balance. So we have a smooth piece of rhythm and we have a more jumpy staccato, syncopated rhythm there, which sends a message. But rhythm equals repetition, or repetition creates rhythm. So keep that in mind when you're trying for a rhythmic feeling to your layouts. Now, every good design needs to have a focal point or a point of emphasis. Here's a really simple example of what focal point can be, and in this case it's the large letter T. If that gray shape there was a paragraph of text, the eye would go to the green T, because if the text were black on a white background, our eye goes to the scale of the T and also to the fact that it's in color. And also our eye tends to go to the upper left of a layout generally first, so we're going to look there first. We tend to read from left to right and from top to bottom, and we look at things that way too, most generally. So if you want to emphasize something, one way to do it will be to place it in that position. Now here we also have a secondary focal point, and that is this yellow rectangle over here. It relates to this one because it's the same yellow, but it's not quite as bright because there's nothing going on in it. This could be a yellow rectangle with black text in it to balance the other piece and relate to it, but still be distinctive and set apart. So we have a major focal point, primary focal point, and then the secondary focal point here. And in this case it's using color, and here it's using color and scale. Next is contrast, and for this example I'm using something called text color. Text color is nothing to do with the color of the text, it is the way that the text is spaced. And you can see in this type sample that the way these different paragraphs have been spaced creates really interesting and varied text color. The larger font paragraphs look actually lighter than the others because they're much more widely spaced, and it sets up a very nice contrast look, and it's much more interesting on a page than if everything were the same font and spacing and sizing. Sometimes you can't avoid that. Sometimes you have to set things in a consistent manner because it's, consistency is really important. But if you had the option with several different topics on a page, for example, and you wanted to break up the text to make it interesting, consider working with your text color, which is basically your spacing and your sizing, to create different effects. And the contrast really is nice. It gives the eye some place to travel, gives the eye focal points, and it's much more interesting to look at than all the same plain gray text. Now we have breathing room, or sometimes called negative or white space. And I had some fun with this phrase, let me breathe, by tracking it super tight. The letters are touching and it looks like it's suffocating here. You can read it, but it's actually a pretty good illustration of the phrase, because it's hard for it to breathe, doesn't have enough room. So I increased the tracking, put quite a bit of space in between the letters, and it's like, a sigh of relief. So generally speaking, you want to have sufficient spacing between your letters. Also remember that you want to have good room around your titles, good room around any graphics or anything on your page, especially with margins. Once in a while you can bleed something off the edge, but generally speaking we go for nice breathing room. Okay. Now what's happening over here with this green rectangle? It might look fine. The text looks fairly readable. There's nothing really bad going on here, but it is a no-no, and here is why. If you have a colored text box, your text goes all the way to the edge of the text box, it is too tight. Okay, even though there's breathing room around it with this white, it's right up to the edge of the green, and that's too tight. So that is a no-no. How do you fix that? In InDesign, you go to the Object drop-down menu, you select your text frame, you go to the Object drop-down, Text Frame Options, and then you change your inset spacing. You increase it, and the text will pop in to the box a little bit, and it will make a nice margin around the text. So you have to have breathing room for all your text, regardless of where it is sitting on the page. So do keep that in mind. Lastly, we have proportion and scale. Here we have a sense of a disproportionate layout here. The headline is way too big for the elements, and the little boxes here are just not the right size for the headline, and all this space over here is empty. It looks very top heavy. Okay, so we need to change the scaling to make things more proportional. And so over here, this has been achieved. The word headline has been sized so that it is exactly the width of the two gray square rectangles, which would be, say, pieces of text or paragraphs of text. The headline sits nicely atop each of them. And then these little magenta rectangles can be images. They might be overlapped, they might be graphic elements, but they use up this space nicely, and of course always keeping the alignments in mind. And proportion and scale is something that again takes a little bit of practice, but after a while you're going to really start to see when things are not proportional, when things are too small or too large, and you'll get a sense for what works and what is going to balance itself. So proportion can be achieved by scaling your elements so that things work well together. So I hope that this has been a good overview of the design principles that you can apply not only to your graphics and imagery use, but also for our all-important friend typography. Good luck.